virtually drop into your lives for an hour or so to talk about what Anne and I lovingly refer to as our Dirt Trilogy, 3 books that we've written about soils. And how this will work is that I'm going to talk for the first half and talk about a couple of them. Then I'm going to turn the talk over to Anne to talk about the other part. And what we're going to try and do is lead you through these 3 books, Dirt, which is the backstory of how civilizations that mistreated their soil did not last. And that book was written about 10 years ago and sort of got us started on this journey in thinking about soils. Because I'm a geologist, so I wasn't trained to study soils. I was trained to ignore soils. I was trained to look at the rocks underneath the soil. And as a biologist, and when you think about what makes for a really healthy, fertile soil, it's that marriage of geology and biology. So our worlds have kind of converged into this trilogy of books. The Hidden Half of Nature is the one that she and I wrote together, and that tells the story of how microbial life is really the key to healthy, fertile soils these days, and how we sort of led into discovering the amazing world of microbes in the soil and all they do for plants and people as well. And it's about the more recent science of microbial life and its relationship to the plant world and also to the world in our gut of our internal microbiome. And Growing Revolution is the most recent of those books that looks at taking the lessons of history from the first book, the science in the second book, and looking at how we can actually restore healthy, fertile soils on farmland around the world, and doing it with very competitive, economically viable farms. So we're going to try and compress 3 books into less than an hour. So we'll give you an overview of these things. If you want to follow us on Twitter, our handle is @digtogrow. We've got a website if you want to learn more about the books. It's up on the screen too, digtogrow.com. And you can always email us at digtogrow as well. So why would a geologist like myself be concerned about the problem of the state of the world's topsoil? This map shows you the global state of soil around the world according to the UN's map of soil degradation from about 15 years ago or so. And it paints the picture of soil degradation as a global problem. You notice that in the legend down here, then the yellow and the orange colors are soils that are degraded or very degraded. This is painting with a really broad brush at the global scale, but you'll notice there's an awful lot of yellow and red on the map. There's a lot of the world's farmland soils have been degraded to some degree. And estimates are that roughly 1/3 of the world's agricultural land has been taken out of agricultural production since the rise of agriculture due to ongoing soil degradation and soil loss. Now, I also like to start with this particular slide because it also lets me say that you could go into any one of those red zones on this map and you could find farms that are doing the opposite of what you would infer from this map. You can find farms that are rebuilding healthy, fertile soils. And so I'd like to use this map to basically show that soil degradation is a global problem, but to point out that there's exceptions within each of those red zones where one can find farms that are building healthy, fertile soils. So if the first part of this talk is a little depressing, don't worry, we'll get to the more optimistic stuff a little later. And then when I turn it over to Anne midway through for looking at this soil microbiome and soil life, it's gonna mushroom to a whole nother level. And the problem of soil loss and soil degradation is not just a problem of ancient history. That's a lot of what I wrote about in the Dirt book, and I'll share a little bit of that with you in a minute. But I also want to emphasize that soil degradation is an ongoing critical 21st century problem. There's the UN's Global State of the Soil Assessment from 5 years ago now, concluded that humanity, the global us, we're losing 0.3% of our global food production capacity, our ability to feed ourselves, each and every year to ongoing soil loss and soil degradation. And when you think about that number, it's a small number in any one year. But if you think about it the way a geologist thinks about time, and you play it out over the rest of this century, which in geological time is hardly anything, that number becomes 30%. And if we've already degraded 1/3 of the world's agricultural land, and we're on track to degrade almost another 1/3 this century, it's pretty clear to us that agriculture is going to need to change this century. And the big question is, what kind of character will that change have? What will the trajectory of agriculture be? But soil degradation is not just a problem of ancient history. But that is mostly what I wrote about in the Dirt Book. It's the kind of book that you might expect a geologist to write about soil erosion and civilizations. It looks backwards through time. And I took it back from the dawn of agriculture right on through to where we are today and the rise of modern conventional agriculture and the problems that presents for us in terms of ongoing soil degradation and loss. But the emphasis is really on the history. I was fascinated by it. I thought it would be an interesting way to actually go back and look at some of these stories around the world of how societies treated their land. And it turned out that there's a common thread that runs through many of the stories of many societies around the world, right on back to ancient Mesopotamia, the classical Greeks, the Romans, South America, Central America, parts of Asia, Easter Island. There's a whole slew of civilizations that degraded their soil enough that it helped to undercut their longevity of their societies. And there was a common villain that came through those stories. And that villain was essentially the plow, which is a bit ironic because it's a fundamental, iconic implement of agriculture. And when you think about what do farmers do, plowing is one of the top things that come to mind. But it's also a very destructive act in terms of what it does to life in the soil and physically to the soil itself. And why is that? Well, think about what a plow does. When you till the soil, you're inverting the soil. You're basically creating a blank slate on the surface, wiping out the vegetation that was there and starting over, which makes it really good weed control, which is why it's been very popular in many societies in one way, shape, or form or another around the world, time and time again. But it fundamentally alters the balance between rates of soil production and rates of soil erosion and leads to dramatically increased soil erosion. Think about all the native landscapes that you may have visited in your life that were below timberline. So that in the areas of the landscape that has soil, there's not a lot of bare rock exposed other than on cliffs. Nature tends to clothe herself in plants, and there's long-term relationships between plants producing organic matter to helping build fertile soil and holding the soil in place and retarding erosion. Our soils and plants have co-evolved since plants colonized the continent some 450 million years ago. Tillage, the act of plowing, leaves the ground surface bare and vulnerable to erosion by water or wind for some period of time until the next plants grow back, and that can accelerate erosion to be faster than rates of soil production. And this is essentially the problem that many societies have had around the world. And it's not just ancient history. The history of the early colonial United States is one in which soil erosion actually played a major role. And I write about this in the Dirt Book and explain the role of how soil erosion in the southeastern states actually helped to set up the economic conditions that led to the Civil War. This gray noodle I'm showing you here, it extends from Virginia up here in the upper right, down to Alabama in the lower left, and it's the hill country. And it shows the Piedmont region. And this map shows you the amount of soil erosion since colonial agriculture began across this broad region of the US, one of the early breadbaskets of colonial North America. And you'll notice that this gray is about 4 to 10 inches of topsoil loss in the last couple hundred years. The black areas are more than 10 inches of topsoil loss. How big a deal is that? Well, if you go back, as I did, and you read some of the early accounts and journals of the early explorers and settlers and the early plantation owners across this region, they report that there was about 6 to 12 inches on average of rich, fertile black earth, rich topsoil on the forest floor when they would first clear land for planting. And it would only take, tobacco was a very erosive crop. It didn't take more than about 3 or 4 years before that topsoil would be eroded off and they would clear more forest and keep moving on. If we could erode off virtually the entire topsoil off a region where you can go today and find farms where what's exposed at the surface is the subsoil, the topsoil is literally missing across much of this region. If we could do that in just a couple hundred years of tillage-based agriculture, plow-based agriculture, imagine what the Greeks and Romans could have done with the 1,000-year run at their heartlands. It helps to explain some of the dynamics of those early civilizations. And that's the kind of stuff that I go back and talk about and explore in the Dirt Book. But the idea that we could lose the topsoil off one of the regions that was an early breadbasket of North America and do it in just a couple centuries puts into perspective the idea that long-term soil loss is a problem that can actually have an impact on human societies. And there's one other element to land degradation and soil degradation that I really should mention, because soil degradation is not just about the physical loss and erosion of the soil. It's also about the degradation of soil organic matter. And what Anne will be getting into in a little while will really help explain why that's so important for agriculture. But this example here of two soils, the one on the left that's a little darker brown, and the khaki one on the right, is an example from within that gray noodle that I just showed you in North Carolina. So it's from the hill country of the Piedmont of North Carolina. The parent material for these soils are identical. They're from fields that are literally across the fence line from one another. What's different is the one on the right, this khaki one, is from a conventional tobacco plantation that's been farmed using intensive tillage and agrochemicals for the last 100 years. The one on the left is from an abandoned farm that was reverted back to forest about 120 years ago. And you can notice there's a very fundamental color difference, the chocolate brown versus the khaki color. The one in the conventional field looks an awful lot like beach sand. And that's because it pretty much is all that it is. This is Miocene age, 10 million year old beach sand. That we can get back into the geological backstory of that area if we really wanted to. But the point is, vegetation and plants can actually improve the soil over time, putting organic matter back into the soil. And you can ask yourself, as a gardener or as a farmer, which of these two soils do you think is more fertile, and would you rather be farming? And I've yet to have anybody say it's the khaki one. The one on the left is obviously much more fertile. The only difference between these soils is how people treated the land for the last century. And so if you look at the magnitude of soil organic matter loss in farmland soils in the United States, we've essentially turned original soil that was like this into soil that's like this. We've decreased the amount of organic matter in our agricultural topsoil by roughly 50% over the course of the last couple hundred years. So the problem of soil degradation is not just the loss of the soil, it's also taking fertile soil and reducing its soil organic matter content. Now, as part of writing the dirt book, I basically wanted to look into, well, how fast are the world's soils eroding now? And how far out of balance may soil production be with relative to soil erosion, or how fast is soil erosion proceeding above rates of soil formation? So I basically went to the library for about a month one summer when my graduate students were out in the field, and I compiled as much data as I could find on rates of soil erosion from conventional tillage-based agriculture. So those are rates of erosion off of plowed fields. The numbers in parentheses here show you how many peer-reviewed academic papers I read to gather the data that then went into making the average or the median on the right. So that's half the values I found were larger, half the values are smaller. Just showing you the middle one because it's simpler that way and gets the basic idea across. And the world's conventional farmland soils are eroding at a rate of about 1.5 millimeters a year. That's not a terribly fast rate, right? Your fingernails grow faster than that. Only a geologist would think that's a screamingly fast rate of something, 1.5 millimeters a year. But when you compare it to the rates of soil production, this fourth line down here, this blue number down here, soils naturally form at the pace of a couple percent of a millimeter a year. The long-term geological erosion rates of the continents averaged over the entire time plants have been on this earth is about the same as the average rate of soil production today. Couple percent of a millimeter a year. And there's a reason that those numbers are close to each other. There's a long-term balance between long-term erosion rates and long-term soil production rates. What's different? And if you look at erosion rates under native vegetation, they're in that same ballpark, fraction of a millimeter a year. These blue numbers are all a couple orders of magnitude smaller than that red number. That's the big problem. We've been eroding soils off our agricultural land a lot faster than nature can replace them. And if you look, though, for some good news in this story, because that's kind of not a terribly good news contrast there. If you look for the good news, it's that if you look at rates of soil erosion under no-till farming that does not use the plow, where seeds are directly planted into the soil, that gets erosion rates down to comparable to natural long-term rates of erosion or rates of soil production. So the bad news is that we're losing topsoil at a rate faster than it's being reproduced. The good news is that we don't have to. The problem is not that we farm, the problem is how we have been farming. And I'll get more into that when we get into talking about growing a revolution in a minute. But the main point of the dirt book was that soil erosion played a role in the demise of ancient civilizations, from Neolithic Europe to classical Greece, Rome, the southern United States, Central America, and other societies I catalog in the book. It's a very common storyline that runs through many civilizations around the world. And that, of course, brings up the question of, is soil restoration possible? Could we actually reverse the historical pattern, that historical decline? Could we develop an agriculture that would build healthy, fertile soil as a consequence of intensive agriculture rather than degrading soil? And I'm happy to say that we're now going to sort of move over into the more optimistic end of the talk, or at least of my part of the talk. And I'll mention that the place that I really learned about the rapidity at which we can rebuild healthy, fertile soils was watching Anne's efforts in our garden to restore the soil in our yard when we bought a house in North Seattle years ago, and she wanted to make the garden that she had always wanted to have. She'll be telling you a lot more of that when I turn the talk over to her, but I just want to advertise what an amazing job her gardening efforts did. Her biologically, insightfully driven efforts to turn the soil we originally had, the stuff on the left-hand side of the screen, my right hand there, that khaki stuff, it looks a lot like what was in that North Carolina tobacco plantation, doesn't it? The soil on the right-hand side of the screen, my left-hand hand, is the soil that we had as of a couple years ago. And again, that darker color, it's richer, it's more fertile. The color difference is due to carbon in the soil. There's literally tons of carbon that's been parked in the soil in our yard as a result of converting this soil into this soil. She's going to tell you more about how she did that. What I want to do is basically advertise how, when I was finishing writing the dirt book up and Anne was turning our soil around in our yard, the light bulbs went on to say, oh, well, if we could do this in an urban setting, could you do this? Would it be feasible to do the same kind of a thing on a full-scale commercially operating farm? So I took some time to visit farms around the world, farms where they'd been turning soil like this khaki soil in the left-hand tube here into soil like the soil on the right. This is experimental plots at the Ohio State University where they were using techniques that turn out to be fairly parallel to what Anne was doing in our garden, but they were doing it on cornfields and soybean fields and vegetable fields, turning relatively infertile soil into much more carbon-rich, more life-filled fertile soils. That's the story that I told in Growing a Revolution, of visiting those farmers around the world who had rebuilt soil health. And I saw that how the things they had in common was that they had adopted the principles of something that's called conservation agriculture. It's a style of agriculture that can match conventional crop yields, but using far less fossil fuels and far less chemical inputs. And what are the principles that are essentially at the heart of conservation agriculture? Well, it turned out that there are essentially three that worked on small-scale subsistence farms in Africa, coffee plantations in Central America, large ranches visited in the Dakotas, vegetable farms in Ohio, corn and soybean farms in the American Midwest. The farmers who had been very successful at doing to their soil what Anne had done to ours in our yard, turning relatively degraded land into very fertile land, had all engaged in minimal or no disturbance. So they were doing no-till farming or planting their seeds directly in the ground without tillage, without inverting the soil. They were maintaining a permanent ground cover of cover crops and retaining crop residues. So they were adding organic matter to the soil, or keeping and retaining organic matter that grew there. And they all practiced diverse crop rotations. They were not just doing one or two crops. They were not doing functional monocultures. And their diversity of their crops were helping to break up pathogen carryover, which allowed them to really reduce their pesticide use. So let me tell you a little bit about a couple of those farmers and what they were doing. The first person I'll introduce you to is Dwayne Beck from Dakota Lakes Research Farm in South Dakota. He was one of the first farms that I visited, and he had basically gone through several decades where he had moved into adopting no-till farming, adopting cover crops, adopting complex rotations, sort of in series, adding these elements that all together add up to conservation agriculture. And what they basically did is it allowed him to reduce their use of diesel, fertilizer, and pesticide by more than half. And when you think about what the main costs in most sort of modern American farms are, diesel, fertilizer, and pesticide are at the top of the list. These are big ticket items. If you can cut your cost by half, you greatly decrease your expenses. But so what happens to your harvest? Well, check out what they did. With the traditional yields of soybeans, they're getting 63 bushels an acre. Once they went to this full system of conservation agriculture, they boosted it up to 79 bushels. Their yields went up. They were harvesting more, but spending less to do it. Same thing with their corn yields. They went up by about 10% or so in this example. And that was really what started to turn me into an optimist on this issue that we could turn around the problem of soil degradation, because there's agricultural practices that we can shift to where we're not sacrificing yield to restore the soil. And it can save farmers money by reducing their input costs, by rebuilding the fertility of their land, and they get comparable yields. That's a recipe for a more profitable farm. When I left Dwayne's farm, I basically asked him, hey, he was dealing with North American farms. I asked him whether the same kinds of principles and ideas would work on small subsistence farms in Africa. And he said, don't ask me about it. Talk to this gentleman here, Kofi Boa. Notice his hat, got dirt, get soil. I knew when I got out of the truck to meet him that I would like the way that he thinks and how he does things. And he basically had figured out a way to adapt those same principles of conservation agriculture to meet the needs of small subsistence farmers in Ghana, where he runs the no-till center. And he'd taken them from their traditional slash and burn style of agriculture, which had reduced the soil organic matter content of their soil from about 4% down to around 1% by once they ran out of new land to clear and they kept slashing and burning the same land over and over. It's a recipe for degrading the land. He taught them how to shift to no-till and cover crops, and they get the diversity into their systems by planting multiple crops in the fields at the same time. These are small farms, labor-intensive, hand-worked farms. But what happened? Look what happened to the erosion rate. It dropped by a factor of about 20 or so. And what happened to their crop yield? Well, their corn yield went from 1.5 tons a hectare to 4.5 tons. It tripled. Their cowpea yield doubled. And these were for farmers for whom the Green Revolution kind of bypassed them because they don't have money to buy fertilizer. They don't have money to buy pesticides. They don't have money to buy patented seeds. What Kofi taught them is a way to think about their soil, prioritize, as Anne will tell you more about, the life in the soil, and adopt those practices of no-till, cover crops, and diversity that are a recipe for cultivating the beneficial life in the soil, which is a recipe for more productivity using fewer agrochemical inputs. And that is a recipe for a more profitable farm. This gentleman here is David Brandt. He runs the Brandt family farm in Carroll, Ohio. His example is worth going through because he is a farmer who grows, he sells corn, wheat, and soybeans into the North American commodity markets, but that's not all that he grows. He also grows diverse mixtures of cover crops in between his cash crops, like that tillage radish that he's modeling there for you. And what that allows him to do is he has a much more profitable model than his neighbors as that field in the background is. So what are his neighbors doing? They're doing full tillage. They do 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 2.5 quarts of Roundup or glyphosate per acre. They're spending $500 an acre, and the year that I visited their farms in 2015, they were harvesting roughly 100 bushels an acre. They were only getting $4 a bushel for their corn though that year, which means that for every acre of corn they grew, they lost $100. And there's something seriously wrong with an agricultural system if very hardworking people on very rich natural farmland lose more money the harder they work. What was David's secret that year? He's been doing no-till with cover crops at the time I visited for about 44 years. Well, he'd been doing no-till for 44 years. He added cover crops later. He gets his diversity in with his diversity of his cover crops. So he's not tilling. He saves on diesel right there. He's only using 24 pounds of nitrogen and 1 quart of Roundup an acre. He's not an organic farmer, but he's weaned himself almost completely off of agrochemicals. And he was only spending $320 an acre when his neighbors were spending $500 an acre. And he harvested more corn, so at $4 a bushel, he was actually making $400 an acre when his neighbors were losing $100 an acre. That is a recipe for something that would be of great interest to many farmers. and got me very interested in the idea that conservation agriculture and these farming systems that restore the fertility of the land could actually be a not only good for the environment, but good for the small town economies, good for farmers. And the book that Ann and I are working on now is we're looking at what that does to the nutritional quality of food. So what was David Brandt's secret? What he did to his soil. This khaki soil here, and by now I hope you're getting the idea that we're talking an awful lot about turning khaki soils into rich, dark soils. The soil labeled 1971 here is the soil that David started with. This is actually from his neighbor's field, which has been conventionally practiced all along. It's the same soil, the Cardington clay soil. If you look on a soils map, these two soils from David's farm, the one on the left, and his neighbor's farm, the one on the right, would look identical, but they sure don't look identical when you dig them up and look at them, right? This is rich, dark earth. It's back up to an organic matter content that's comparable to the native topsoil that was in the region. The soil on the right has lost its organic matter. It's spiritually lost its topsoil. One of these is much more fertile than the other. The last farmer that I'll share with you is this gentleman here, Gabe Brown. He's actually been reintroducing animal husbandry and livestock to his cropping operation. He runs a ranch where he's using intensive rotational grazing to restore native prairies that are very productive, but he's also bringing his cows in to graze off his cover crops, because managing one's cover crops in a farm like this is sort of a major issue. And what he's doing is he's basically using his cattle to graze off the crop residue from his cover crops. They then manure the land, return those nutrients back to the soil, and he has chickens running on the same land that the cows are running on at the same time, and they eat the bugs that come in and inhabit the cow pies. But what Gabe likes to say is that he's basically no longer paying for fertilizer and pesticide. Instead, he's just selling beef and eggs, and he prefers that model. What's it done to his soil? Again, khaki versus dark black. The soil in his right hand that he's holding up there, that's the soil from the field that I just showed you that had the cows and the chickens on it. It's rich, fertile black earth. The soil in his left hand, that's the soil from his neighbor's organic farm. Now, there's nothing wrong with his neighbor's organic farm other than that they plow enough that it limits the ability to rebuild the soil organic matter. So the key point here is that while Gabe is not an organic farmer, he's doing things that have rebuilt the health and fertility of his land. And the key to that was so reducing his inputs that I would tease him that he's an organic-ish farmer. He's virtually an organic farmer, even though not technically. So what were basically the keys to all these farmers in different parts of the world who had taken degraded, worn out farms and turned them into rich, fertile soil? It was this simple: is ditch the plow, cover up, and grow diversity. No-till, cover crops, and a diversity of crops. Some, like Gabe Brown, were adding livestock back into the mix. People like David Brandt didn't have livestock, and they were perfectly successful at bringing their soil back as well. So this is the recipe that we came up with in terms of researching that and writing Growing a Revolution. What are the benefits of conservation agriculture? Well, these farmers were able to harvest comparable increased yields, which means we're not giving up the ability to feed people to restore the land. These are complementary effects. We had greatly reduced fossil fuel and pesticide use and all the environmental benefits that flow from that. It increases the amount of soil carbon, all those color changes from khaki to black, that's carbon in the ground. These restored soils were better able to retain water, which meant that you have better climate resilience in your crops. But importantly, it also meant higher farmer profits and less off-farm pollution. The best way to reduce nitrate pollution in waterways is to use less nitrogen fertilizer on farms. So the benefits of conservation agriculture are manyfold, and they are economically viable today. So I've turned into a bit of an optimist on our ability to actually solve the soil degradation problem. And I think we're on the eve of what I'd like to think of as the fifth agricultural revolution, one centered on soil health and the kind of practices that I've been talking about. But what I'll do now is turn the podium over to Anne so she can tell you more about the process that we went through in our yard and in writing The Hidden Half of Nature, because this was the stuff that really connected the dots on those other two books. So I'll turn it over to her now.
All right. Thank you, Dave. All right. Hello, everybody. I wish we could be there in person, but that's not to be. So Dave had mentioned The Hidden Half of Nature, and this book was very much an exploration of the microbial world. And it led us into the world of actually what's called a microbiome. Now, for those who may not have heard of that term, there's not a lot of really mystery around it. It's simply the community of microorganisms. And as I'll talk about, there are specific communities in the soil as well as on and in the human body. So this story begins really in our yard here in North Seattle. And I had always wanted a garden. And it was not until we were both well into our 30s that really happened. And part of the reason we bought this house is that when the Norwegians who originally built it in 1918 did so, they pushed it way to the far side of the lot, and that left a pretty large side yard. And so that was what we had to work with. Now, when I show this slide in somewhere like Arizona, they think, oh, wow, look at how green everything is. But I am not going to be able to pull the wool over your guys' eyes, because you look at that and you're like, yawn, that is just another boring Northwest yard. And that was actually how I felt about it too. I thought it had potential, but I wasn't really sure exactly how I was going to go about changing things. And so that really began with me doing a lot of scheming and dreaming. And these were the days before the internet, where you used to get photographs and make a photo montage. And then you would start drawing all over that. And so there were a number of different designs and ideas that we went through. And because a garden is plants, right? So plants are on your mind. What kind? Where do we want them? How are they going to screen us from neighbors? How are they going to do, all of these various things that we turn to plants for, to do things. And so that day came, we had cleared much of the lot off, and then I panicked, because look at this. This was not my dream dirt whatsoever. This was my dead dirt. I couldn't believe it. We had spent time, we had spent money, we had spent hours thinking about the garden. And yet, isn't it embarrassing for me to have to say this, that the geologist and the biologist didn't really quite think about the soil beneath our own garden? So this was quite a challenge. And the time of year that we first put the garden in, it was also not a good time at all. It was August. And what do you think the water holding capacity of basically this pile of rocks, this glacial till, was? Not much at all. And that was my chief concern. In any event, what do you do when you have something like this? You fix it up, right? We had the fixer-upper house, and we often say we also had fixer-upper soil. And this was also pretty much the beginning of my education as a gardener, which I call the Organic Matter Chronicles. And it began, of course, with a wheelbarrow. Now, I have to say this. Initially, this wheelbarrow did not come with flames. I painted those on because I knew this thing had to move fast. I needed to get that soil, back to life. I was ready to put plants in. So I can definitely recommend putting flames on your wheelbarrow. It took a while to figure out the paint, the paint colors and so forth, but boy, it was really worth it. So what did I put in that wheelbarrow? Organic matter. This is just an image to show you the assortment of things that I ended up getting a hold of. Now, what I want to say too is, and I think especially for you folks, if you live, outside of a city in a rural area, there is so much organic matter hanging around that, it makes somebody like me drool just about. But this is what was available to me in a city for free or for, very, very cheap. You can see the things listed down there at the bottom of the slide. I'll draw your attention just to this one item here, Zoodoo. I'm guessing some of you probably know what that is. If not, it's the composted manure of herbivores at the Woodland Park Zoo. And you can send in a postcard, and if that postcard is drawn, you get to go to the zoo and fill up on as much Zoodoo as you can load into your vehicle. So that was always fun to try and win the Zoodoo lottery. And one of the other things that is in abundance around here, of course, is coffee grounds. And that is this pile right here. If I can manage to get them somewhat composted, I will. If not, I'll mix them up with these other materials, and they sort of break down and compost in place. So I want to take a look now at one of my actual mulch mixes. This is done in the early summer, and decaying wood chips are probably my favorite base for a mulch mix. First of all, they don't break down very rapidly, which is really, really good if you're wanting a mulch for weed suppression. They're also an excellent substrate to support beneficial fungi. So I always like to get a good amount of wood chips in there. And then early summertime, I'm pruning my evergreen hinoki tree, and I like those. And then anything else I prune that's pretty, I know is going to break down pretty rapidly. I think I've got dogwood leaves in there and some sword fern. And so I'll throw that into, and my general rule of thumb, I don't get real super picky with composting things. What I always try to remember is I want a lot more carbon sources than I do nitrogen sources. And so far, I haven't really managed to kill anything with the mulch mixes that I've put out. So that's the good news. And I do need to let you know also, that's right, there's the neighbor's bouquet is in this particular mulch mix. So should you ever give me a bouquet, there's a very good chance it's going to end up in one of my mulch mixes. And what I thought that I was going to be doing with that rotten, horrible soil, I actually thought I was going to go make these mulch mixes, spread them out. I was going to return with a shovel or a pitchfork or something, and I was going to dig all of this stuff in. Well, the fact of the matter is this: I had no time to do that. I had a whole garden to get installed and to get this mulch on top of the soil. And I came back after that first summer, and it was maybe 6-9 months later, and I'm thinking, wow, this is starting to break down. I don't even think I am going to dig this in. And so it became really a job of layering mulch mixes upon mulch mixes upon mulch mixes. Now, can you get too much mulch on? Yes, you can. But that's how you learn what the right amount is and what the wrong amount is. And for me, in my garden, that's, you really don't go over like 4 to 6 inches or so is about as much as I'll go. And of course, the garden is different now. And I put probably far less mulch out than I used to. So I want to show you now. Here you can see this is that horrible soil that we started with. And that is what we had within about 5 to 7 years or so. And on top is one of my decaying mulch mixes. The point here is that you can see how that mulch is contributing organic matter to the underlying soil. And this is where David and our eyes got big, because we thought, geez, if we could do this here on our little urban lot in the city, what if gardeners all over the place did this? What if farmers did this? This was a way to use organic matter and get it back into the soil. Because the fact really is, whether you're talking ag soils or urban soils, most are low in organic matter, and certainly compared to native soils around here, lower than what that would be. And you've seen this picture, what we started out with right there, that horrible stuff, and what we have today. So if all of that's happening below ground, what's going on above ground? Well, this is a shot of the garden. And when I talk with farmers, I joke around with them because I tell them, well, I have herds too. My animals, all my critters, they just live in the soil. They're not walking around on top of the earth, okay? And then I tell them about my crops of maple trees. And of course, every garden needs to have flowers, especially for our pollinators. And what is a garden if you don't have a portion of it, at least, dedicated to growing vegetables? So this was how the garden was coming along. And one of the things that I realize, even to this day, what you're looking at is my living fence. Now, did I make up this living fence? No, I stole it from the English. The English have really, really nice living woven fences. And they use flexible woody shrubs, things like willow, and this happens to be our native dogwood shrub, red twig dogwood. And so I've just woven these twigs together, and it's great in the summertime because it's nice and leafy. I'm on the inside of this living fence, and the reason I like all that greenery in the summertime is I've got all my junk on that inner part of it. And I don't want to look at that and have other people be looking at it. It's not terribly attractive. But when I turn around and I look outside, I really sort of see the garden and the world in a different way when I put a frame on it. And what I really realized was that the practices that we were doing here on our lot, they're regenerative. And I'm a writer, and I think about words a lot. And I began to think, what does that term regenerative mean? And the first place to start, of course, is with the dictionary. And, I'll buy this first definition. It's a little annoying. It's one of those examples where they use the word that you're trying to learn what it means to describe the definition. Okay, fair enough. I like that second meaning. I think we can all relate to that. Spiritual renewal or revival can certainly be a regenerative experience. But it's this third one that I thought, that's really what I'm after. Yeah, this is renewal or restoration of a body part, and it's a normal process. In other words, this is supposed to be happening. It's just that in farming and in gardening and in other aspects of our lives, you get too far removed from nature and you sort of forget what's a normal function and how should we be going about making sure that we've got things in place so that the normal processes like regeneration can happen. And that leads me to a place that I want to take you now, beneath your feet, because yes, I had my wheelbarrow and I was filling it up and I was doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and I would help Dave do some of that heavy lifting with me. But really, there's a lot going on beneath our feet. And fundamental to the soil microbiome and to plant health is a place called the rhizosphere. And what it is if you were to draw a line around every single root and root hair on this image and come out just about a nanometer or so, hardly anything, that would be the rhizosphere. So it's this zone that's all around roots and root hairs. And what goes on in the rhizosphere is actually pretty amazing. It's estimated that the rhizosphere is one of the most life-dense and biodiverse places that we have on our planet. And not many people realize this because, of course, all of these creatures are microscopic. So they're hard to see, they're certainly out of sight, so they tend to be out of our minds. But once you start learning this stuff, I'm telling you, it's going to drive you out of your mind because it's really cool. And why is the rhizosphere there? What is going on? That has to do with exudates. And so the green body of a plant, it has a monopoly on sunshine, and it can take in carbon dioxide. And with those two things, water and the miraculous chemistry that plants can do, they're ginning up all kinds of compounds and molecules. And a good number of those, these are the exudates, the plant will push those exudates out into the rhizosphere. And what really are exudates? You'd recognize them. They're things like different kinds of fats, different kinds of proteins, different kinds of carbohydrates. And this is even more interesting. A plant will take about 40% of the energy that it has obtained through photosynthesis, and it will put that toward manufacturing these exudates. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I would take 40% of a paycheck and go leave it out on the sidewalk for just anybody to pick up. This is a huge investment on the plant's part to be giving away this much of its stuff. And where does all that stuff go? It goes into the rhizosphere, and it really becomes the energy source for the soil microbiome, for everything that lives in the rhizosphere. And that includes everything like in the upper left here, this clump of bacteria. They are voracious consumers of a plant's exudates. Microscopic, of course, we can't see them. And over here, what we have, this is a root hair. And these circular objects are the spores of mycorrhizal fungi. And these thread-like objects are their hyphae. And they're coating and swathing this root hair. Fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, also will consume a plant's exudates. And of course, this is a food web, so if you eat, that means something else is probably going to be eating you. And in this case, down in the lower left, we have a nematode. And nematodes are a diverse group of organisms. Some are quite bad, they can be pathogenic, but there's also beneficial ones. And you want the beneficial ones, but if you want them, then you need to be having their food source, which is these guys, the bacteria. Nematodes will hoover them up by the hundreds. And then a little bit larger, you could probably see this sort of a microarthropod with the naked eye. It's consuming things like this nematode, probably also feeding on dead plant material as well. So this is just sort of a snapshot of the food web that relies on a plant's exudates. And so really what we have here down in the rhizosphere, it's a biological bazaar, all right? And so you know what a bazaar is. This is a place where trades are made. And so what you have here is, picture all of these red things here are colonies of bacteria, and they're all over that root hair, and they're consuming all of these exudates. And what does any organism do after they eat something? They excrete their waste. But in this case, what bacteria are excreting are really not waste at all. We call them metabolites, and they include things like plant growth promoting hormones. So here we have one kingdom of life, the microbes, providing a substance that is absolutely critical for plants, a growth hormone. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many other types of metabolites that members of the soil microbiome make that plants rely on. I want to talk a little bit now about our fetching fungi. They, of course, are attached at one end to the root, and then they are, tens to hundreds of feet away from the plant's root system. And what are they doing out there? They're getting nutrients. They're mining nutrients out of the soil, which they transport through their hyphae back to the plant. And in exchange for bringing those goodies back, the plant rewards them with exudates. And this is an actual picture of some of these fetching fungi. Here you can see them, and these are soil and rock fragments, tiny, tiny. And the fungi are working their way all around in here and mining out things like phosphorus in particular is a very, very important thing that fungi will fetch for plants. So you can buy phosphorus, of course, in a bag at a nursery. That's fine. But you can also grow some fetching fungi, and they can go and get all the phosphorus that's sitting around in the soil for you. Okay, I want to, how big a deal are these mycorrhizal fungi? This is an experiment that Japanese scientists did. And over here, what we have is a control. So there's no mycorrhizal fungi here, 0 colonization. The next row down, that's one type of one species of mycorrhizal fungi and another one. And so at 100% colonization of G. margarita, what you get is about 10 times more the phosphorus uptake compared to the control. And if you get about 87% colonization with this other species of mycorrhizal fungi, you get somewhere around 8 times more the phosphorus uptake. That is pretty significant, especially when you consider, you know, the P of NPK. It's out there in the soil. And so if you're letting the biology of the soil do your work for you, this is where you can get your phosphorus. And I want to just mention one other really pretty intricate, cool thing that happens between a plant and its soil microbiome. We often think, you know, oh, there's the above ground part of the plant and the below ground part. And really though, it's just like us. They're all one body. And so if a plant gets an insect herbivore munching on its above ground part, it will send signals, communication signals, down to its soil microbiome that say, hey, I need some help here. I've got this insect herbivore on my back, munching away at my greenery. I need some help. And what certain bacteria can do is either manufacture compounds or precursors for the compounds that a plant will then take and use to basically get it into the plant tissue, and the insect herbivore takes a bite of that stuff and says, yuck, I am out of here. Now, a plant's not really interested in killing this thing. It just wants it to get off of its leaf and go off to some other plant and start eating that plant up. And so this is where you see it's very much an interactive two-way relationship between soil microbiome and everything that goes on throughout a plant's body, really. And that brings me to this illustration. I'm imagining that you all have seen some image like this. Roughly maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of the plant body is above ground. And then you've got, oh, kind of this puny little root system down there below ground. Well, you want to know what? That's fake news. That is not really what is going on here with the green body of a plant, right? Think about this. You have that rhizosphere. You have all of this signaling. You have exchange of exudates and metabolites. This is a ceaseless conversation. And that really can just mean one thing. This is really where the plant intelligence resides. It's in the rhizosphere, in all of the communication and in the symbiotic relationships between a plant and its soil microbiome. And so if this is the seat of intelligence for a plant, that is where the plant brain is. That is what is going on. We're used to thinking in our terms, you know, the brain is the above ground part, it's on the top. But you need to really kind of reverse that with a plant, because their brain really is down in the root system. And this makes sense if you were to, if you read up on plant evolution, the first plants that came onto land out of these watery aquatic environments, they really didn't have much in the way of leaves and photosynthetic tissue at that time. They had some, but not a lot. And they needed to prop themselves up because they were no longer suspended in water. And so the root system was the first part of the plant that really got going. And once a plant sunk its roots down there into the earth and into, the first emerging soils, they encountered the fungi and the bacteria and all of these other microbes who had been consuming organic matter and producing metabolites. And all of a sudden, there was a brand new player there in the soil environment, plants. And so the whole root system got going way, way, way before above ground tissues, certainly way before flowering plants. And of course, the concern of your group, which is fruit trees. And so if that's where the brain is, down there in the root system, does brain food matter? It does. I'll give you a second to look at this and let you know that there's 3 different treatments going on here. One of them is conventional fertilizers. One is nothing at all done with the roots. And the third is composted manure. Which one is which? Here you can see. Now, what I think is pretty interesting about this is doing nothing at all. That's not that bad, really, right? And this, of course, is a situation that we have with our wild native plants. There's no gardener, there's no farmer, no arborist, fruit tree grower out there in our wildlands fertilizing or mulching or doing any of that. So in other words, the botanical world has long had a way of taking care of itself and of developing symbiotic relationships to get what it needs. Conventional fertilizers, I would say not a good looking root system there. Now, that's not to say that above ground here, that I bet things could probably look pretty good, maybe even pretty buff up there. Probably a lot of biomass, probably some lush foliage. But what this really tells me is that there's not much happening at all in the way of soil microbiome or all of that communication. And so there's 2 ways to think about this. A plant that just doesn't have much of a soil microbiome is really sort of depending on the person to go out and buy all this stuff at ag supply shops and nurseries and so forth, because conventional fertilizers kind of scramble up all this signaling that goes on between a soil microbiome and the plant. Because if a plant is able to take up, say, phosphorus from a bag that's been applied to the soil, it's really not going to make a lot of exudates to feed fungi. And if it's not going to be feeding a lot of fungi, who needs much of a root system, right? So over here to the composted manure root system, however, there is exudates pouring out of this root system by the bucket. Why? Because we want a robust and a vibrant soil microbiome. And the only way you're going to get that is through a lot of below ground biomass out of which exudates are constantly flowing. All right, I'm gonna now, just for the last several slides here, I'd mentioned microbiomes at the beginning, and I wonder if you've been sitting there wondering about your own microbiome, maybe. Well, you do have one. Every organism has a microbiome. And when it comes to the human microbiome, just a couple quick factoids. There's anywhere from about the same number of cells that comprise our body. There's about that same number of members in the human microbiome, up to maybe 2 to 3 times more. So one way or the other, we're either sort of exactly even with them or they are outnumbering us. And so what are all of these microbes doing in and on our body? Well, it turns out quite a bit. They have a huge influence over our immune system. And that's what much of the human microbiome research is focused on, is how it affects our immune response to things like, we're all thinking about COVID a lot these days. And there's a unique microbiome in lung and respiratory tissue. The other thing about the human microbiome to know is that the lion's share of the human microbiome lives in your digestive tract. Now you might be thinking, why is that? Seemed like maybe it would be outside on the skin. No, here's why. Look at all those nutrients, right? Nutrients, that's what the game is about. So we're eating our human diet, whatever that might be, and that makes our digestive tract one big sack of breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day in and day out for our microbiome. And what's really interesting about the human microbiome is where it lives. And that's what this illustration is about. Up here in the stomach, there's really not a lot of our microbiome up there because why? We have a lot of stomach acids and it's not a very friendly environment. This is a place where things dissolve, and that is largely the purpose of stomach acids, to get this food on its way to being broken down. I'll just have you note here, this is numbers of bacteria per milliliter, okay? And you move further down the digestive tract, numbers go up. And what's really happening in the small intestine is all that food that you've eaten, it's time for it to start leaving the digestive tract. So it's down to like molecule sized things, and it gets absorbed out the intestinal wall into the bloodstream, and off it goes to wherever it's needed. And the lower part of our digestive tract, look at these numbers, right? Roughly 10 times, well, actually even more, it's logarithmic, way more than what we've got going on in our stomach. And the primary thing that is happening in the colon is that there is one kind of food in our diet that we lack enzymes to do much in the way of breakdown for. We're pretty good with our proteins. We got the enzymes for that. We're pretty good with fats. We can break those down fine, but it's carbohydrates. And when I say carbohydrates, it's really important to realize there's kind of two basic kinds of carbohydrates. You have, recall that slide that there was a donut going down that person's mouth. So a donut is simple carbohydrates, small sugars, easy to break down. In fact, most of the simple carbohydrates are out of your system by about here. The kind of carbohydrates that make it down to the colon are the complex carbohydrates. So this is what all this nagging of, maybe a spouse, doctor, whoever, for us to all eat whole grains and eat whole fruits and vegetables, and basically to eat whole foods. That's because, in particular with whole plant foods, that's what the human microbiome absolutely thrives on. And what they're doing down here in our colon, this is like tranquil grazing pastures for them. They are consuming all the carbohydrates for which we lack all the enzymes we need, and they're basically producing metabolites in our colon through fermentation. There's not a lot of air down there. And it's these metabolites that we then take up and use. For example, one of these metabolites is it's a short chain fatty acid. It's called butyrate. That's made there in the colon, and it just so happens that the cells that comprise our colon, this is quite unusual. They're not actually nourished so much by nutrients in our blood, but they are nourished by this bacterial metabolite, this short chain fatty acid called butyrate. So you want, the colon's, that's a hard-working place. The whole digestive tract is hard-working as the soil. So you want to make sure your microbiome is well nourished down there because it's got a big job to do, right? And what does that make that? In particular, the colon, it's another form of a biological bazaar. That's right. And of course, that means our gut, our colon, is a place of intelligence. We kind of have two brains. We have the one on top up here, but we also have the one in the lowermost part of our digestive tract. There's a lot of intelligence going on down there. All right, I'm going to wrap things up now. And I want to just sort of run through the basic concepts that I've gone over and hopefully help you think about them in the context of both roots and the human gut. Of course, this is all about nutrients, right? That's the game of life, acquiring nutrients. And when it comes to microbiomes, without a fully functioning, vital, vibrant microbiome, any organism, the dog, the cat, the fish, the plant, without a functional microbiome, it's going to be hard to get all the nutrients you need. And microbial metabolites, I've nattered on about that. They are actually, you know, they if we could, wouldn't that be something to see on a nutrition label? When you eat this, your bacteria are going to make that. So not all microbial metabolites, however, are beneficial. It all kind of depends on what you're eating. And that there's a lot more on that in the book itself. And then lastly, microbiomes have a huge role in immunity and defense in both plants and people, as I've touched on, and also this all adds up to intelligence. And so just as David had left you with sort of the takeaway for farmers, I've got one for gardeners out there too, and it's this: regenerative gardening and taking care of microbiomes, at least out in the soil. Drop the shovel, cover your soil, and grow diversity. What we know about exudates is each plant produces completely different cocktails, and they benefit very different kinds of communities in the soil. And this is the power of diversity, is that everybody down in the soil there gets fed if you're growing as diverse a group of plants as possible. All right, that pretty much concludes things. And I think Dave's gonna be showing up here. And Becky, you can go ahead and move us to the Q&A.